number 10, we have Captain America. I know it feels weird to have Cap in the 10th spot on any list about power, but remember who he's up against. Captain America's best trait is his unmatched leadership stat, which for superheroes is a really important angle to consider. But on a list about individual power, I'd say it only goes as far as who he's actually leading and ultimately fighting alongside. But without his strategic advantage, Captain America is still an extremely powerful Avenger and beats out plenty of other contenders that didn't make the list. The combination of his impressive fighting skill and his advanced strength levels is good enough to garner attention, but of course his vibranium shield is what really brings him to another level. Vibranium is a metal that actually absorbs all energy and contains it entirely. This means that whatever the shield is hit with, the metal itself will absorb the recoil almost entirely. Not to mention, it can pack a serious punch when it's thrown and will return to Steve's hand on command. This gives Cap a huge offensive and long-range advantage when he isn't showing off his massively impressive hand-to-hand combat skills.
Number 10, Martian Manhunter and Fire. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I am also not the biggest fan of fire either, and I would absolutely hate being set on fire for so many reasons. But for such a powerful hero who can shapeshift at a molecular level, change his entire genetic makeup to let him pass through solid objects, withstand ferocious attacks, or bend light waves around his body, it just seems a little silly, right? Not to mention that he comes from Mars, otherwise known as the Red Planet or the Fire Star. So why is this one of his biggest weaknesses? Well, long before Martian Manhunter even existed, a race of aliens known as the Burning caused some serious damage with fire in order to create their offspring, which, needless to say, people weren't too happy about. After the Guardians of the Universe separated the offspring into the White Martians and the Green Martians, they were all imbued with a congenital pyrophobia, aka a fear of fire. So it kind of makes sense why he's so afraid of it. Not only does it physically hurt him, but it also scrambles his most prized weapon of all, his mind. This fear and weakness is so intense that when he's exposed to flame, he has the capacity to self-destruct, either combusting into bits or dissolving into rivers of Martian liquid. Want to know more about the Martian Manhunter? Well then check him out in his first appearance in 1986's Justice League of America, number 255.
Number 10, Magic. So who is Magic for, you ask? Well, let me tell you. Scarlet Witch. You see, back in the day, Scarlet Witch's powers were slightly different than how they are portrayed today. First off, she can only do a limited amount of spells. Like after she did one, she would need to rest. But the other weakness was that she had to see what she was using her spell on. So if she couldn't see it, she couldn't do the magic spell. Or if it was just obstructed. Of course, that is very different than what her powers are today. I mean, she wiped out almost every mutant in the world. And she didn't see all of them. Her powers have evolved so much from those days.
At number 9 is the one and only Spider-Man. It was tough to decide where to put Spidey on this list because he's so versatile, but he's also quite young and inexperienced. Well, at least he's supposed to be. But what really puts him at one ranking higher than the almighty Captain America are his Spidey senses and his healing factor. These two abilities really give Spidey the edge and help to define him as a more agile and crafty hero than many of the others on the list. Where Spider-Man might lack in sheer power, he makes up for in his adept precision and dexterity. And while he may not pack a huge punch in some of the more advanced combat situations that the Avengers face, he doesn't let anyone get the jump on him in any case, because he can always sense what's coming and has very quick reflexes to make the next move before his opponents even realize they'd missed him. In other words, Spider-Man often plays the role of David, while his opponents play the part of Goliath. Another thing that's important to note is that his suit upgrades allow him to gain huge strength boosts, expanding his power levels to a level that may never see its limit.
Number 9, The Flash and being too fast. At first, I've got to say this one confused me so much because that's kind of the Flash's whole thing, right? Well, when it comes to Barry Allen, his speed might be his greatest strength, but being too fast puts his life in mortal danger. In Crisis on Infinite Earths, we see the Flash use his super speed to thwart the Anti-Monitor's evil plan, but the speed vortex he creates to stop the villain's antimatter cannon from firing is so fast that it sweeps the Flash away along with it. He ends up being stranded for 23 years in the Speed Force, you know, that mystical energy field that gives all the speedsters their powers, and spends that whole time running and trying to figure out how to get back. Basically, what happened is that Barry ran way too fast for his body to handle and he atomized himself. Thought to be dead by his closest friends, including Wally West, who took up the Flash mantle in his absence, Barry's apparent death was a huge shock for everyone, and also entirely his own fault. Check out more of the Flash for yourself, starting with his first appearance in 1956's Showcase, number 4. Number 8, Power Girl and Raw Materials. You'd think that being weak to kryptonite would be their only weakness, considering how easy it seemed for people to get their hands on it. But Kara Zor-El from Earth 2 actually had another pretty big weakness at one point. They were vulnerable to unprocessed natural materials such as branches and rocks for a short while. This also includes stone, dirt, and sand. Basically anything that can be found on Earth that isn't man-made. In Peter David's Supergirl Volume 4 number 16, she gets knocked to the ground and impaled by a pretty big tree branch, which, in her defense, would put anyone on the ground. Supergirl helps yank out the branch, and with this weirdly sociopathic smile on her face, she asked, "What, are you vulnerable to wood?" It took a second, but after she was no longer in pain, she replied, "Worse. To any raw, unprocessed natural materials. So, sticks and stones really can break my bones." God, dumb joke and even dumber weakness. Check her out for yourself in her first appearance in 2011's Flashpoint Volume 2, number 5. Number 7. Adam Strange and Forced Deportation. Who knew that archaeologists could also be superheroes? Well, apparently Adam Strange did, because that is exactly what he is. He inadvertently found himself on the planet Ran and was gifted with all the powers of a superhero in Mystery in Space, and it's not exactly explained why. Sounds pretty great, right? I mean, what could possibly be his weakness? Well, it's not actually his fault or in his control. This life of bliss he lives on Ran is frequently interrupted by his rather inconvenient transportations back to Earth, where he has no powers at all. The technology responsible for bringing him to Ran, the Zeta Beam, only allows him to remain there for as long as it's transmitting back to Earth. And as it takes the beam a few good years to reach Strange's home planet, it's not exactly easy to catch a ride back. Strange might have been recruited as Ran's savior, but his timing issues really make this role more of a temporary gig. He could be midway through his heroics before vanishing without a single trace. He even left his wife to nearly get eaten by a tiger once. Luckily, as Alan Moore's Swamp Thing series clarified, the Ranians are more than capable of looking after themselves when Strange isn't around, and thank goodness for that, because I wouldn't be relying on Strange much either. Give his story a read for yourself, starting with 1986's Outsiders, number 6. Number 6. Human Torch and Asbestos. Now, don't get me wrong, Johnny Storm, aka the Human Torch, is a force to be reckoned with. Not only can he create, absorb, and manipulate fire, which is pretty awesome on its own, but his Nova Flame is hot enough to vaporize the particles of anything in his way, whether it's a bullet, a building, a bad guy, etc. Interestingly enough though, his powers can't seem to penetrate asbestos. Now this doesn't seem like much of a weakness now, given that asbestos is now banned across most of the world, but back when the Human Torch was first created by Stan Lee and Ernest Hart in 1963, it was a much more common thing, as it was used to insulate pipes and wires, soundproof rooms, and even make cheap garden furniture. In Strange Tales number 111, Asbestos Man came into play, dialed up Johnny Storm, and arranged a showdown between the two. The Human Torch wasn't really all that into it, but he agreed nonetheless and showed up completely underprepared. Asbestos Man used his super asbestos suit, a fire retardant shield, and a fisherman's net to go toe-to-toe with the Human Torch, and he wreaked havoc on the Human Torch until he developed mesothelioma and needed an oxygen tank to stay alive. Moral of the story, kids, is always prepare for anything, and please, don't breathe asbestos. Check out more of the Human Torch's story, starting with 1961's Fantastic Four, number 1. Number 5. Wonder Woman and being tied up. Superheroes don't come much more kick than Wonder Woman. She's an extremely skilled warrior with enough power to take on the gods and win, and she's shown time and time again that she can hold her own in the world of comic book heroes. However, the Golden Age Wonder Woman was bound by an interesting Amazonian rule that really did not work in her favor. Known as Aphrodite's Law, it states that when an Amazon girl permits a man to chain her bracelets of submission together, she becomes weak as other women in a man-ruled world. This gender-specific weakness lasted from Wonder Woman's debut in 1942 right through to the mid-80s, when DC finally retconned this out for good. This weakness is less literal than metaphorical, meant to demonstrate Marston's argument that women are only vulnerable to men when they choose to be. But still, I am very glad that this was gotten rid of for good. Check out Wonder Woman more for yourself, starting with her first appearance in 1942's All-Star Comics, Volume 1, number 8. Number 4. Gladiator and Self-Confidence. Cal-Arc, aka Gladiator, is arguably one of the most powerful comic book heroes ever, gifted with planet-shattering strength, super speed, heat vision, frost breath, and a few psionic abilities as well. He's a superhero anyone would love to be. However, even though he is loved, he never really learned to love himself, and that is sometimes his biggest downfall. Although low self-esteem isn't exactly fun for anyone, trust me, I know, for Gladiator it's actually a fatal weakness. His power fluctuates according to his confidence, as seen in Dan Abnett's and Andy Lanning's War of Kings crossover in 2009. Get him to doubt himself or even his abilities for 1 second and he can be defeated by opponents with far weaker abilities than him. A prime example of this is shown in War of Kings number 3 when Rocket Raccoon manages to convince Gladiator his gun will hurt himself and, despite withstanding far worse in the past, succumbs to self-fulfilling prophecy and is beaten. Give his story a read for yourself, starting with 1977's X-Men number 107. Number 3, Daredevil and loud noises. Now we all likely know this, but Matt Murdock's loss of vision took away the natural gift of eyesight that we all take for granted, and replaced it with echolocation, an uncanny radar sense that allows him to basically see things through sound. Unfortunately for many heroes, their greatest strength can also be their greatest weakness, and such is the case for Daredevil, as his extreme sensitivity to sound can completely incapacitate him. In Daredevil Volume 2 West Case Scenario, he is subjected to a high decibel ultrasound, 120 decibels to be exact, by the dastardly Purple Man, who knows his weapon is excruciating for a man of Daredevil's gift. Daredevil's head spins and he looks like a man under a sorcerer's spell, leaving him completely vulnerable to a follow-up attack. The same can actually be done using intense smells as well, since his sense of smell was also heightened after losing his eyesight. Although Daredevil can and does go toe-to-toe with pretty much anyone in a fight, he will get utterly emasculated by a stink bomb or a supersonic sound. Check out more of Matt Murdock for yourself, starting with his first appearance in 1964's Daredevil number 1. Loud noises! Number 2, Green Lantern and wood. If you're a bit confused, that is totally okay. This is not a weakness that is common across all of the Green Lanterns. It's specific to the very first Green Lantern, Alan Scott. Despite being armed with a magical ring and a spectrum of pretty much limitless powers, Scott seemed to have another fatal weakness other than the color yellow. He first realized that this might be a problem for him after he was hit in the face with a wooden log. And then after a series of wins and victory laps, Scott realized tree bark might be his potential undoing. Put a little more succinctly, items made of wood cannot be lifted or broken by energy from the ring, nor can barriers of emerald energy stop projectiles crafted from wood. Apparently this vulnerability to wood was because the green flame was an incarnation of green growing things, and thus could not be turned against them. Guess you could say he, can't get wood. Check out the first Green Lantern for yourself, starting with 1940's All-American Comics, number 16. Number 1, Captain Marvel Jr. and his own name. Poor Freddie Freeman. Out of all of the weaknesses on this list today, he probably drew the shortest straw because his weakness is his own name. If Captain Marvel Jr. tries to introduce himself to a superpowered ally, or for some reason feels the need to say his name in the middle of a battle, he'll instantly be transformed back into Freddie Freeman, a ordinary young lad who relies on a crutch to walk. Or if he speaks his superhero alias aloud in the guise of Freddie Freeman, he'll transform into a shimmering beacon of muscly justice and give himself away. Jerry Ordway tried getting around this flaw during Captain Marvel Jr.'s sporadic appearances in Teen Titans between 1995 and 1998 by having Freeman refer to himself as CM3, since he was one of the 3 members of the Captain Marvel family at the time. Also, he could avoid accidental transformations, but that change didn't really stick around. Honestly, for someone who inspired many of Elvis's onstage looks, that is one weakness that I don't know if I can overlook. Check him out for yourself in his first DC appearance in 1995's The Power of Shazam, number 3.
Number 9, Unstable. This one is for Bruce Banner, aka the Hulk. Everyone knows that the Hulk is extremely powerful and almost nothing can stop him. But as he gets stronger and stronger, he also becomes more and more unstable, depending on the incarnation that is. So he could be on your side one minute and then something sets him off and then he loses control and he's completely against you. There are times when Bruce is able to fully control Hulk, but that's not always a guarantee, and that's why it's kind of considered a weakness in this case. Number 8, Sentry. Wait, hold on. Why is Sentry his own weakness? Well, that's because he's his own worst villain. The darkness inside of him, also known as the Void. He is one of the most powerful heroes that Marvel has, so the fact that the darkness inside him can just change him in an instant is really scary. To be honest, maybe this one's just not even more super silly, it's just more super scary. But at the same time, it's crazy that he can become his own worst enemy. Man, the Sentry sure has a lot of demons. I'll say that much. Number 7, Stubbornness. Oh, Steve Rogers. Now, to be clear, I love Captain America. But one of his flaws would be his own stubbornness. Once he has his heart set on something, you will never be able to change his mind. I mean, a civil war happened in both the comics and films because of it. And I'm not saying that he is right or wrong. I'm just mentioning how it kind of affected things. I actually understood why he did what he did in both the films and the comics. But overall, it can get him into really messy situations. And because of that, it would be considered a weakness. But we all still love him anyway. I mean, how can you not love Cap? He's just a lovable guy. Number 6, Emotional. This one has to go to Star-Lord. And again, I understand why he did what he did. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's from Avengers Infinity War, when he found out that Thanos had just killed Gamora. and he ended up kind of freaking out and messing up the plan to get the gauntlet off of Thanos' hand. I mean, they almost had it. I feel like anyone would have done the same thing in that scenario, and a lot of people can deny that, but if you just found out that the love of your life was killed, of course you would be emotional. Which, yes, makes it a weakness, but come on, you can see why he did it, and if he didn't, we wouldn't have gotten Avengers Endgame. So, we all should be thanking him. So thank you, Star-Lord, for giving us, well, I mean, kind of both amazing movies. Number 5, power depletion. So this one belongs to Captain Marvel, aka Carol Danvers. Now, I don't know if we are ever going to see this power on screen, but in the comics, her powers can deplete if she fights too hard, and she'll actually need time to recharge. I feel like they won't really add this ability to the MCU. I mean, it's only shown up a handful of times in the comics, but I mean, it would make for an interesting twist, that's for sure. Like if she was in some hardcore battle and she pushed herself too hard, and then she would lose her abilities. So then that would make the villain have the upper hand. I mean, there's a lot of cool story avenues you can take with this power. For some reason, I don't think they're going to add this in. I feel like they would have shown that already, especially in her own origin movie. Number 4, ego. This weakness can apply to a lot of heroes, but in this case, it's going to Tony Stark. The man has a big ego, which is actually why a lot of people like him, but it can get him into trouble. I mean, Tony is absolutely brilliant, but he also sometimes never thinks he's wrong, and that is really dangerous. He has humbled out in both the comics and the films, but his ego has caused a lot of problems. I mean, you could say that it contributed to why Ultron was created in Avengers Age of Ultron, and why Tony didn't really want to admit that he screwed up. But he has grown, and that shows why he's such a cool character, and why he resonates with so many people. Because when a character grows, it just makes their story arc that much more meaningful. Number 3, sound. Okay, so sound can really affect Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil. Since all of his senses are amplified, he is subject to a lot of new threats. One of those is sound, which many villains have used against him in the comics, to the point where he couldn't even stand up and fight back. It wasn't really used as a weakness in the TV show, but it was in the film starring Ben Affleck. In the film, the subway or the church bells really hurt him. He would be on the ground screaming in pain. I mean, it would kind of suck, especially if you're going somewhere and there just happened to be a loud noise. But, he works through it. And if there isn't anything loud around, look out, because he is one of the best fighters in the Marvel Universe, so just make sure that there's nothing loud around Daredevil. Number 2, ethyl chloride. This one is pretty crazy, and it affects everyone's favorite wall crawler. In the comics, it was revealed that this can actually take down SpiderMan. Usually ethyl chloride is used to help pain, after surgeries or for infections, but that's not the case for Peter. If he's injected with some, it will take away his powers. If it's small enough, that will be temporary. But if he gets injected with enough of it, it would actually kill him. Yeah, kill him. It's pretty crazy. And something that is used to help pain in humans can cause Peter such great pain. So I mean, he would definitely need to be careful if you ever went to the doctor for something and they were like, oh, here, have some ethyl chloride. He'd be like, oh my god, no, please, no. That'd be a fun explanation. But, Peter would figure it out. He's used to making up wacky stories to try to cover up his adventures as Spider-Man. Number 1, no hammer, no powers. Back in the day, when Thor was banished to Earth, he had the alter ego of Donald Blake. But he couldn't be without his hammer for long because, well, he would lose his powers and turn back into Donald Blake. So if Thor dropped it, or he just, maybe he misplaced it, and he couldn't get back to it in under a minute, well, then he'd be screwed if he was fighting just some random villain. I mean, I'm really happy they kind of changed his power as he went along and didn't include it in the MCU. It does seem a little bit silly and kind of limits what he can do, but it's part of his history, so it will always be there.
At number 8, I'm putting Wolverine. As the most published comic book superhero ever, Wolverine has had the most experience out of anyone on this list. Not just because of all the things he's done, but also because of all the years that he has lived. His healing factor is so impressive that his age is extended by a great margin, making him appear nearly immortal. In fact, there have been a few times where Wolverine was entirely reduced to his adamantium-coated skeleton, and he was still walking around as if he'd just been a little banged up. But on top of his durability, he's also one of the most balanced heroes all around, which makes him a huge contender on a list about power. He's extremely agile, being quite skilled in acrobatics. He's got a very powerful offensive stat with his adamantium claws. He's also got a stealth stat since he's able to blend in as a civilian when his claws are retracted. He's got insane durability with his whole skeleton being coated in a metal only comparable to vibranium, and even if he takes takes a massive blow, his healing factor acts so fast and so efficiently that he's back to full health before he's even stood up. He's one of the big guns. At number 7, we have Shang-Chi. If this was a list of the best hand-to-hand combatants that the Avengers have ever had, I'd probably place Shang-Chi first. I mean, he trained Spider-Man for crying out loud. But to be fair, Shang-Chi's biggest strength mainly comes with his empowerment from the 10 rings. Not only do they give him superhuman strength and durability, but he's able to use the rings as weapons. He can use them as projectiles or at close range, and can shrink and enlarge them at will, making them perfect for entrapping his enemies. And on a list about power, it's also important to consider things like flight, which Shang-Chi also gets from the rings, because during any kind of battle, one's mobility tends to go a long way in how they approach their enemies. But even without the rings, Shang-Chi still finds crafty ways to show off his extreme power, like during the Infinity storyline when he uses Pym particles to grow the size of a dragon and takes it out without the help of the rings. At number 6, we have one of the most important members of the Avengers and my personal favorite, Iron Man. What could I say to try and convince you of Iron Man's placement on this list? Well, my favorite way of describing Iron Man's sheer power level is that it's technically uncapped. Tony Stark's biggest trait is his immense intellect, which shouldn't necessarily be considered on a list about power as a standalone ability. But when that intellect is able to produce the Iron Man suit, the War Machine suit, and every iteration of spider armor, as well as not to mention the Hulk Buster armor, it surely should be considered. So I say that his power potential doesn't have a ceiling, only because if he's not the most powerful on this list right now, there's plenty of room for him to improve down the line with his inventions. But as he stands, he's still got his own AI system Jarvis, integrated into an all-powerful Iron Man armor, which is outfitted with near endless ballistics and energy weaponry. And I'd argue that Iron Man has a certain level of omnipotence as well, because his systems are always tapped into external sources that support him in battle, like drones or even backup armor upgrades on the fly. Okay, at number 5 is Black Panther. T'Challa is not to be messed with, and it's not just because most of his gear is outfitted with all the vibranium anyone could ever hope for. He's also got a level of dexterity and stealth that brings his combat abilities to another level. This could be seen in the comics when he's able to take down Namor not once, but twice, or when he also finds a way to take out the Silver Surfer, which is an insanely impressive feat on its own. But what puts Black Panther above Iron Man for me is that he's got a similar intellect and employs it almost more impressively at times. He's able to create similarly ingenious pieces of technology to Stark, and much of the time totally on the fly. Like the one time when he creates a device on the spot that blocks Thanos' synapses in his mind, knocking him out there and then, at least for a time. But this is a big moment that shouldn't be ignored. Considering he's capable of this level of technological aptitude, and he's a superpowered being on top of it, it just gives him that extra edge over Iron Man for me. And that comes from a huge Iron Man stan. Although Black Panther is in my top 3 as well. At number 4, we have Hercules. I want to acknowledge that Ares could also easily hold this spot, but I figured that the list only had room for one Greek god. And having been teased in Thor Love and Thunder's post-credit sequence, it's looking like Hercules is set to appear in an upcoming MCU project. And it's about time. Hercules is one of the few characters that has ever been able to contend on an even keel as Thor, which I think speaks to how powerful he is in the comics. Son of the god of lightning, Zeus, Hercules is known as the god of strength, which should be enough to put him on this list to begin with. But what could also convince you would be, I don't know, that one time when he picks up all of Manhattan while facing off against Thor, or the time when he destroys the Thor clone in Civil War, which acts as a turning point for Cap's army. If that's not enough to convince you though, Hercules is also known to run at speeds above 100 miles per hour. Even though most people associate Hercules with Greek mythology, he has a very lengthy run with the Avengers and proves himself as one of their most powerful members ever. At number 3 is Nova. Being basically the protector of the cosmos, Richard Rider's Nova had to make it into the top 20. Being one of the primary members of the intergalactic law enforcement agency, Nova brings a cosmic level of power to the Avengers. And the main ability that really puts him above the rest is his power absorption, which is capable of using an enemy's power against them. And the limits of this power are yet to be truly maxed out, meaning that I'm not sure if we can even know the extent of his power level quite yet. But considering he's been able to weaponize gravity itself with this ability, I'd say there aren't even really limits at all. Of course, when he takes in power, it has to go somewhere, and it's usually emitted as a highly powerful energy beam that can be aimed at any nearby or distant targets. In prime form, he's also been known to travel at near light speeds, which is verging on speedster level. One of his most notable feats is when he sacrifices himself by trapping himself and Thanos in the Cancerverse. This just shows his immense influence and how far he'd go as a protector of not only Earth, but the cosmos as a whole. At number 2 is Gilgamesh. You know that at least one of the Eternals had to make it onto this list, so here he is. Gilgamesh doesn't have a long run as part of the Avengers, but the short time he gives to them is enough to put him nice and high up on this list. Now, most superheroes tend to have superhuman strength and land somewhere on the scale measured in the amount of tons they can lift usually, but we can basically just throw that scale in the garbage because Gilgamesh is off the charts in his strength stat. His strength level is on par with that of Hercules and Thor, only maybe being usurped by the Hulk himself. But on top of his extreme strength level, he is also capable of flight, energy blasts, and a certain level of energy manipulation, which, when all paired together, makes for a massive powerhouse who beats out many of the other members of the Avengers. Finally, at number 1 is a hero who could have arguably made the part 1 of this video, Captain Marvel. Born as a human, Carol Danvers' DNA is fused with Kree genes, thus turning her into a next-level superpowered being. Being able to fly 6 times the speed of sound and having an adept energy manipulation skill, there's no wonder why Captain Marvel is considered one of the most valuable members to ever grace the Avengers. Whether she's destroying asteroids with a single punch or surviving an HLA energy bomb, Captain Marvel seems to be everywhere at once. And she sort of can be, given her insane speed and near omniscience with her flash precognition ability. This power allows her to anticipate events all across the cosmos from wherever she is, which is part of what makes her stand out as one of the foremost protectors of the cosmos. It's also just really helpful in anticipating the moves of her opponents before they make them. And although she does acquire this power when she's turned into binary, there are still remnants of it within her to this day.